So GPT-3 created this wave of fear that came crushing down on content marketers and SEOs when they saw what it could do a couple of weeks ago. And on the other end, many people were excited because it potentially takes off the weight of creating lots of boilerplate text. So I was curious, what is your take on the impact of, or the potential impact of GPT-3 on SEO and content marketing?
So I think it's probably important. Have you talked about GPT-3 yet on your show already? Do listeners know what this thing even is?
Slightly, yes. I touched on it in a blog post, but I think as a quick explainer would be amazing from you.
Okay. So there's this group called OpenAI that creates these, among other things, lots and lots of different AI models. And an AI model is a fancy term for software, right? It's a piece of software. There's this general pre-trained transformer, GPT, family of models that this group has created. GPT-1, which was about 2 years ago, GPT-2, which was last year's, which has been used very heavily for natural language processing and natural language generation, writing net new code. And then this year, appropriately, the model is now version 3. Version 3 is a departure from the previous versions in that it now, instead of having lots of parameters and guardrails to generate text, it takes a prompt. So you'll say, you, for example, write in a quarter of a paragraph, tell it how much content to create, and it will try and essentially guess at what the rest of the logical pieces of content should be. And it does some really cool things, one of which that I'm personally entranced by is called neural style transfer, where it is trained with something like how Ernest Hemingway writes. And then you feed it J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, and you say, rewrite Harry Potter in the style of Ernest Hemingway, and it will change the language structurally to do that. Now, there's some upsides and downsides with the way this new model works. Obviously, the big upside is that it requires a lot less prompting to use the actual model once you've trained it, and it's called priming. And it can do all sorts of very different pieces of tasks. It can write, for example, reasonably credible poetry. It can do regular text, marketing dreck. Marketing content's not always that exciting. Novels, things like that. It can also generate code. There were examples of it writing code from scratch, given a prompt. Say, like, I generate a window that has these 4 buttons, and it would write this in Swift was the language being used. Now, that all sounds cool, and as you said, some people very afraid, other people are very optimistic. Here's the downside. It's not really a downside, it's just knowing it, the limitations. Number one, this model is gigantic. It is 174 billion hyperparameters, and a hyperparameter is the best way I can explain hyperparameters and hyperparameter optimization is think about an oven, right? And you're baking cookies, right? You can put these cookies in the oven. And what are all the dials on the oven? There's things like time, there's temperature, there's convection, not convection. Each of those are parameters, and every degree from like 170, which is your oven's keep warm setting, to 800, which is clean. When you do hyperparameter optimization, you're essentially going to try and bake a cookie at every single possible device setting. And so this model has been taken the English language and I believe it's trained mostly on English, and has essentially tried to write 174 billion different ways, these hyperparameters tuned, in order to generate text. That means that from a computational perspective, it is extremely expensive. It requires big hardware, big iron, lots and lots of GPUs, and the ability to use in a production capacity is going to be constrained by those resources. It's not going to be, you're not going to put this on your laptop and run it. You can, but you expect to wait a couple of years for some output. So that's one downside. And the second downside of this model right now, at least from the folks who have talked about it, and one of the things that early adopters have said is that it requires what's called a lot of pre-priming, a lot of giving it samples, a lot of very tuned text in order to know what to do. And that's, again, no surprise. Basic number one basic of machine learning is you've got to have good data to tune a model on. And the tuning process for this apparently is also very computationally expensive. So is it something that a content marketer or an SEO professional needs to be like, oh my God, tomorrow I'm out of a job? No, not even close. It requires a lot of expertise, it requires a lot of hardware, and it requires a very well-tuned data set to be able to generate the incredibly cool proofs of concept that have come out. But again, it's not something you're going to fire up a web browser and just say, okay, make me my next 1,000 blog posts. We're not there yet.